Hey everybody, how's it going? Thanks for joining me this afternoon. I've got a great stream with a great guest I think you're really going to enjoy. We've seen a ton of leftist political violence recently, from the assassination of Charlie Kirk, the shooting of Donald Trump. We just had shots fired at Tim Pool. Other conservative commentators like Matt Walsh and Benny Johnson are receiving threats at their house from people. We see a lot of leftist violence, but over and over again, we hear from academics, we hear from journalists, we even hear from Trump's former head of the FBI that it's actually conservatives, radical right wingers that are the most violent people in the United States, most likely to bring domestic terror or political violence. But is that true when we look at the actual statistics, the actual data? Is that really how it breaks out? Joining me today to discuss this topic is a social scientist and someone who does a lot of great work on YouTube, Aydin Paladin. Thank you so much for joining me.
Hey, thanks for having me. Yeah, I've been looking into this. I recently did a video about it. And for the most part, there is a lot of veracity to the claim that the right is more violent, but you have to go a little bit behind the front-facing part of the data to be able to see maybe why that's the case or what's really happening there. Because that part wasn't so obvious until I actually went through the data sets for that.
Yeah.
Specifically, what I wanted to avoid with that is, as I'm sure you're well aware, oftentimes when you talk about violence or aggression or crime, they'll throw in things like prison violence while excluding things like gang violence. And that is a very easy way to skew data to produce a certain result. So when I looked at it, I just looked at terrorism, official reports of terrorism. There are two data sets that are used. It's the Global Terrorism Database data set, which is, of course, global, but includes the United States. I also ran a similar analysis, very similar to identical to the one I did in the US, in the UK, and found almost an identical trend. The numbers were not precisely the same, but the valence was identical, and the effect sizes were nearly identical. And then the other data set is I always forget the name of it. It's profiles of individual radicalization in the United States data set, or PIRIS. That one is, of course, a US only data set. The thing to be aware of with both of these data sets and with any kind of mass scale data analysis is that there's inclusion criteria that whoever is putting these data sets together decides on what goes in, what's kept out. So you have two data sets, and when you look at how many terrorist attacks has the right done versus the left, and they're completely oppositional to one another. Those two data sets, even just for the United States, covering the same periods of time. So that's initial problem with it right out the gate, right?
Well, and that's definitely why I wanted to have you on, because I feel like this is something that the headlines just get out there. People look at one line somewhere and they simply don't have the mastery to understand, the data sets you're talking about, the nuances of how things are selected. So I want to get into all that with you. But before we do, let's hear from today's sponsor. Everyone knows that college is a major investment, so it's really important to do your research. You want to find a school that shares your values, but who has the time to dig through all those college websites? Well, today I've got great news for you. There's a free, easy-to-use resource that does the work for you. It's called ChristianCollegeGuide.com. This online directory of over 250 Christian colleges and universities is a one-stop shop. ChristianCollegeGuide.com lists all the basics, such as acceptance rates, tuition costs, and academic majors. But here's what makes this resource truly special. ChristianCollegeGuide.com will show you the school's faith commitments, its campus policies, and its spiritual life. All the info that you will need to find the college you can trust. This is the definitive college guide for Christian higher education, and it's completely free. So if you or someone you know is considering college, go to ChristianCollegeGuide.com to create a free user profile and start today. It's ChristianCollegeGuide.com. So, Aiden, before we jump into the main topic, I was wondering if you could maybe introduce yourself and provide some background, because I think you do some really interesting work. In fact, it's funny because I just had a bunch of leftists yelling at me that I was citing YouTube videos and Substack articles when I wrote a book. And it's like, well, actually, this is where the interesting work gets done. Your academic citations are boring and stupid because the actual interesting work is being done in all of these different spaces. So why are you doing serious academic work in a place like YouTube when, obviously traditionally this is something you see from think tanks or universities, that kind of thing? What brings you to doing this kind of work on this platform?
Oh, well, I was a graduate student and a doctoral student. But I got extremely burned out by doctoral school in particular. So I took a sabbatical, and while I was on sabbatical, my dad said I should do something because I was going insane, having nothing to do. So I started doing YouTube, and I found that actually it's a lot easier to reach people by talking to them, via the internet, one-on-ones, or so it seems, right? Than it is to try and teach anything at a university course. So, I mean, although I might one day want to go back to the university and to academia, this was a way I could do more freely what I wanted to do, which is just to actually find out the answers to questions or try to answer them to the best of my ability and share that information with other people. And the internet is far better at doing that in many ways than our universities at this point.
Yeah, it's been my experience that when I speak to, especially right-wing academics, they tell me actually they just wish they were doing what you're doing right now. Like they tend to find that trying to struggle their way through the university system, its restrictions are already stifling for leftists, but obviously for anyone who has a different political orientation, it's even more so, and they find it almost impossible to actually get any real work done. So many of them are watching people like you and others and saying, okay, that's kind of the model I want to go to now. So I just think it's really interesting that at this point, in a way, the right has kind of created an alternative to university work or academic work that allows people who are promising, who otherwise would have got lost in the system, to be able to do interesting work like yourself. So if people haven't checked out your videos, they most certainly should, because they are all very, very deep dives, as I'm sure they're about to learn here. All right, so let's start at the beginning of this problem, because as you said, there are some truth to the statement that right-wingers are at least more effective at violence. However, there's a lot of different things buried in here. I've seen other people discussing these studies say similar points about the selection criteria, that so often things are skewed because they're including prison violence. They make sure to exclude other issues, and that tends, if you just count the Aryan Brotherhood prison gang as a right-wing
Right.
group, then all of a sudden your terrorism goes up quite quickly. So can you speak a little bit, as you were saying there kind of at the beginning, what events are you looking at? What specifically are you excluding that often is usually included? And is there anything that you're excluding that you think other people are regularly including to skew the statistics?
So again, the two sources are PIRIS, the Profiles of Individual Radicalization in the United States database, and the Global Terrorism database. PIRIS goes from, I believe, 1990 to 2019, and I'm sorry, 1947. And then GDT, Global Terrorism Database, goes from 1975 to 2018, were the most recent versions of those two data sets that are available. Now, that's a bit dated at this point, but those are the two that I had. And that should still, with a long enough time horizon, should be able to kind of give you an idea of patterns that might appear in those data. And again, with the Global Terrorism Database, I compared it against the UK because I live in the British Isles, and they're very culturally similar in many ways. So if something were vastly different, that might be interesting to look at. Instead, what I found was almost identical. So there is the problem with the inclusion criteria. For example, right-wing violence comprises 59% of the included attacks as they are categorized by the people who put together PIRIS. So PIRIS data set says 59% of terrorist attacks since 1947 were committed by the right wing in the totality of the data set. But the Global Terrorism data set, for the totality of it, so worldwide, it's 6% of terrorist attacks made since 1975 have been committed by the right. That's a vast.
Sorry, how many did you say there? Did you say 6%?
6%.
Okay, that's quite a swing.
Yes, 6% globally versus 59% in the United States on its face is an insane difference. Right. So first of all, I tried to limit the amount of years I looked at. So I looked at 1990 to the most recent one, which is 2018 for both data sets. There's been some more recent data from another data set that I looked at more recently that covers up until this year and does not, however, before the shooting of Charlie Kirk. So that was not included, nor some of the raids on ICE facilities, I think, because it went up to, I believe, September, which is a Center for Strategic Discourse, I think, was their data on that. I have it in my notes here. Center for Strategic something. CIS, I know, is the acronym for it. And that had actually the exact same sort of trend in the findings that I was seeing coming out of Pierce and GTD. So, but that again, just prima facie, you can see that like there's a vast disparity in the way that data are handled and the way they're categorized. So I also went through and checked, because the fantastic thing about the global terrorism data set is that they've included in this, and it's massive, massive, like tens of thousands of rows in these data sets. They have included, all of the relevant information about a case, so that if there was something where I wasn't sure, I was unfamiliar with it, I didn't know, it was very easy to go back, trace it, and find out what this particular incident was, and agree or disagree with the way that the people who put together the two data sets may have categorized them. So I just did it manually. Now, my manual categorization is potentially as biased as anyone else's. But this is a problem inherently when you're coding data. But I mostly aligned with the way that there was an analysis by Jasko is the name of the first author that was published in last year, or 2022. They did an analysis of the same data sets. And my analysis almost entirely aligned with what they ended up concluding as well. So there was some external validity in terms of other scholars have gone through it and come up with very similar conclusions as to the coding. What I found that no one had talked about, though, that's included in particularly the global terrorism data set, is that it contains information on foiled plots, and it also contains information on death and injury rates. And when you put those things all kind of together, a different picture about what is happening with violence, who commits it and why, and who causes more death and injury and why, became a little bit more clear. Because it wasn't so much that the right is intrinsically or inherently vastly more violent. In fact, leftist plots were slightly more likely to be uncovered and foiled before they even happened, which means that some of them are stopped before they can even make the attack. And then when they do, they are significantly less likely to cause death or injury. And I don't know, it was difficult when I was writing this of how to explain that without saying skill issue, because like, but it sounds awful, but
yeah.
But that seemed to be sort of what it is. They are planning violence, and when you look in the rest of the video that I put out on it, I talked about the psychological mechanisms that are going on there. Who expresses more violent intent in their thoughts, and it's the left by far. They're far more violent in their intent. I think most people who've ever interacted with any of them at this point, on the internet in particular, internet exacerbates things, hostilities at least, knows that these people were very aggressive. And in fact, it was something like the far lefty tank subreddits were something like 47 times more aggressive and violent than the rest of Reddit. So even the far lefties on Reddit are like 47 times more violent than the average Redditor. So that's in their thoughts and words and actions and those kinds of things. But they are, at least what I found from the two data sets, the amount of attacks are nearly the same, but it's the severity of the attack and the outcome of the attack. Again, more likely to be foiled, less likely to result in death, less likely to result in injury. So it depends then on the way that's always spun, and not unfairly, I'd say, is that the right is more violent. And this year, 2025, is the first year from the Center for Strategic Discourse CIS dataset that left-wing violence, terrorist attacks specifically, have surpassed right-wing ones ever. As I think people may have noticed just from vibes outside of the actual way it's calculated.
So in a way, this reminds me of the suicide statistics, right?
Mm-hmm.
That women attempt suicide far more often, but men are more successful at actually completing that. So it's one of those scenarios where if you look at the raw data without the correct understanding, the correct context, it can make it seem the results quite different there. So that's very interesting that ultimately the big gap is not that one side is planning more attacks or even committing more attacks, but one is more successful once those attacks have ultimately been triggered. And I guess you could say that competence in violence could therefore be construed as being more violent, but it's clearly not the intent of the left to be less violent. They just suck at it.
Yeah, I mean, it's probably not the answer I think some people want to hear, because it gives people good feelings to think, oh no, the right's not violent. I don't know why you would want to think that, personally. I don't know why you would want to think necessarily that your side is incompetent and incapable of violence if power and politics are inherently intertwined. To say, oh no, my side, people who agree with me politically, are weak and pathetic. Again, I'm not advocating violence or anything like that whatsoever, but it's interesting that there's this tendency to want to say, no, the right is not violent, is incapable of violence, when they very much are, as is the left. The left is less capable, but as equal in its intent. And political violence is a thing that will happen pretty much regardless to some extent. I don't know how you would ever just excise that from society. When people get very upset about something, and politics tends to do that, very often that takes the form of violent action.
Yeah, there is. It's very America is a strange place, right? Because in one sense, we are literally a country founded on the idea of political violence.
Yeah.
It's our founding story. Things were so bad, we had to make the appeal to heaven. We had to fight the British. Now, I mean, if you look at what the complaints of the founders were in the Declaration of Independence, they're about 1/3 or 1/4 as bad as literally what our government is doing to us today. But
Yeah.
the point is that was the entire intent, was to say, here, the Declaration is a justification to the world of why we need to engage in political violence
Yes.
and be effective at it. And so obviously now, as you say, we decry political violence. We can never have political violence. And so there's this very difficult pattern of, in some ways, celebrating our own violent revolutionary past, but also saying there's no situation today in which this would ever be justified. Now, again, no one is advocating for anything here, but
Right.
you are right that it's ultimately very bizarre that is the stance that a country that has founded itself in the justification for political violence is ultimately taking with the action now.
Right. And I just don't think, based on, I mean, if you would like, if someone wants to argue it, be my guest. The reality is that looking through the data, and again, knowing that these data have been selected for, their different groups have collated these data sets, both Pierce and GTD. I've gone over them again. There's massive differences, which there really shouldn't be, but there are. Just in the U.S. subsample of the data of both data sets, there are massive differences, something to be aware of. But when I find a consistent trend, not just across the two data sets, in terms of what is the characteristics of the data, not just outside of like percentages and what's been included and what's not, but what are the characteristics vis-a-vis like deaths and injury. Similar characteristics there of left results in less death and injury, right tends to result in more death and injury. That is consistent. It was also consistent in the UK. And that starts when I start to see international similarities in the data sets. And Paris, of course, only covers the US, but in global terrorism, there's both. Now, I only looked at the US and UK. If I had more time, I guess I could go through, France and Canada, Australia, at least the rest of the Anglosphere. And France is usually interesting to look at as well with that kind of stuff. But because I found it in both places, I thought, okay, this seems enough consistent enough for me to say that there appears to be a trend here, which is that the right is better at violence. And it's hard to, I guess, express why you shouldn't run away from that as a concept and instead lie or look desperately for statistics that say, no, the right is far less violent and meek.
Well, and this bears out in other social science research. So, for instance, Steve Saylor famously has his Saylor's law, which is if there's a mass shooting, you can count the percentage of shots fired to people wounded or killed to know which race is actually perpetrating the shooting, right? It's not that there's fewer shootings by blacks than whites, but if you look the ratio of death, you can kind of predict who actually was involved in that mass shooting.
Yeah, these data are sort of like a corollary to that hypothesis, which does seem to very often bear out, is that, when white people when right-wing leaning people or people who are inspired to violence for right-leaning causes, and the way that these data sets work too is that they assign them to known terrorist group affiliation, which is another layer on it that kind of may or may not add validity or take it away depending on how you feel about it and on individual cases. For example, the KKK violence, that's another reason why I kept it post 1990, because there hasn't been a lynching since 1990. I think 1989 was the last one, or 81. It's been a while. But that helped cut out a lot of the, I would say, potentially quite erroneous KKK data, knowing about any affiliations of people, real affiliations, a federal operative interference, and just nixing all of that as a potential confound and keeping it since 1990. But there, you could make that argument about all kinds of different terrorist cells. People believe oh, this terrorist cell isn't real. It's, funded by this or that government, intentionally designed. So maybe that all is true. I don't know. I just looked at the data as they were and didn't try to mess with it too much or recategorize anything. Just let it sit as it was, with the caveats in mind that these data sets are fallible. I found errors in both of them in terms of reporting. They had listed one group called Project 7 as responsible for a bunch of bombings or bomb attempts. And then I went and looked into it, and they were cleared of that well over a decade ago. And it's still in the modern data set, just as one example. But there's tons of errors like that. However, again, consistency in valence and trend, consistency across nations, seems to indicate there might be a consistency to the behavior.
Interesting also the way that these things get categorized because of the way different groups organize, right? So you'd have, I guess, just general urban gangs, and that would not be considered political violence, even if they are at like a BLM rally or something like that. However, you get something like Proud Boys, and that is immediately considered to be a political organization, even if it's officially organized under something like a fraternal structure. And so the way that right-wing, quote unquote, I guess, demography would end up getting coded is political whenever it actually organizes, as where left-wing demography, it's hit and miss as to whether those things are considered political once they organize into violent groups.
Yeah, another beneficial thing, but to be clear, the terrorist data set, or using the terrorist databases and terrorism data, is essentially a snapshot of it, because you can't, it doesn't include that things like, the various amounts of violence from rioting and from looting and from all the things that went on under BLM or during the height of BLM. That stuff's not included. So it's just planned and completed, or planned and failed terrorist attacks from known groups in both instances. A Paris has individuals as well, as the name implies, but it's linked with a certain ideology or group. So it's a little snapshot of a way of trying to look at who actually is committing more violence. It's not a totalizing report. What I looked at was just like this one little area that I was able to isolate out and say in this, because I started looking at it after, of course, the assassination of Charlie Kirk. And it was, in that case, I would consider that a terrorist attack in some degree, but there's no affiliated group there. So that particular incident would not end up being included either probably in GTD or in Paris.
Well, we have the problem that, for instance, again, even the FBI directors have said things like, well, Antifa is just an idea. It's not a real group, right? So even in cases where you literally have a named group with Facebook pages and organization and funding and networks, these aren't considered political terror groups for some reason.
Right.
Interesting that, originally I thought that the 2020 riots just wouldn't be included due to the dates that you were giving for the span of your data sets. But you're saying that even if they had reached into 2020 and beyond, they would not have included any of the Summer of Love, BLM riots, Antifa. None of this would have counted as political violence in
not for
attacks.
This, because they are looking at terrorist attacks, so it has to have been planned to some degree and carried out or attempted to be carried out. And if it was not carried out, then be identified and foiled. Those are the only things that are included, which again makes it of any data set you look at is going to have limited utility, because you can't look at everything all of the time without too many variables getting too involved. And then you've got a very complete model, but it becomes very difficult to pick out what is contributing what to the full model fit. So it's like trying to explain, well, how much is the automobile industry adding to CO2 levels in the atmosphere that contribute to global warming, pulling that apart from all other emissions from the natural, warming and cooling process of the planet, it becomes impossible. So you can try to look at little snapshots of data. And so for terrorism, as recognized by these two data sets that come from two statistical analysis groups, when there's such consistency, it's at least, I guess, interesting to point out, because there's so many, I guess, misconceptions about who does violence, why, and why is there this claim out there that the right is so much more violent and so much more prone towards terrorism, for example. It's not completely based in unreality. It's just a little bit more nuanced than I think most people ever dig deeper than they would. They don't want to go past surface level, because then you might have some answers or rationales, the things that might explain it that are a little bit uncomfortable for those just wanting to look at the right's more violent. Well, why?
Yeah, I
Because
think
they're
we've
more
already
confident.
I think we've already tripped over a few of those,
Mhm.
but okay, so we have the general understanding that it's not that the right is necessarily more prolific in its violence so much as it is more successful in its violence. That's something you see consistently, not just in the United States, but like you said, across different countries. What other insights did you glean from your deep dive into the data?
I'm trying to think of what else was that was the big finding.
Mhm.
There were some of the other things. I went into all the psychology behind it as well, and some of the psychology stuff that was more interesting about what is justifying the violence and where does that come from. I started to look at morals, at people's moral frameworks, and like the trolley problem and stuff. And what I found with on different moral dilemmas, and what I found very consistently across all of the studies that have been done on it is that people who lean to the left have an outgroup preference, as everyone sort of knows now from the mimetic weight set all analysis, the heat map
Yeah,
meme,
right.
which they deny constantly, despite that being like one measure. There's about a dozen different psychometric instruments that measure essentially that, and it's consistent on all of them. But it's the same thing where they have outgroup preference. They will sacrifice the life of a white person before they will sacrifice the life of a black person or a brown person or a person of another religion or ethnicity, etc. They also have this when they have this thing called outgroup fusion, which they tend to get, which is not feeling like you are fused with your in group, as people tend to be. I am an American. I am, this, that, or the other. And there's some shared group homophily. We are the same in some way. They don't have that to the same degree. They have this very strange oppositional thing called outgroup identity fusion, where, the Free Palestine people are a perfect example of this. They care about Palestine. They care about Ukraine so much, places they didn't know existed until it became a media buzz. Those people in particular have, when they have that outgroup identity fusion, which are predominantly leftists who feel that way, are far more likely to say that they would be willing to fight, die, and sacrifice and give up their lives for the cause than people who have in-group identity fusion, fusion with shared nation, fusion with shared ethnicity, shared race. People who have outgroup, they prefer other racial groups outside of their own racial group, other ethnic groups, other national groups. Those people are more likely to say they would fight, die, and self-sacrifice for the cause of the outgroup.
Which is funny because I feel like that's not true at all, right? It's something they would say, but
Yeah.
I think you put into practice. I mean, it's not just that left wingers are incompetent in violence, but it's been my experience, when I'm speaking with people that left wingers are just completely unfamiliar with the realities of violence. They
Yes.
have this Marvel movie understanding of the way that violence works, as where conservatives tend to be a little more, they know if they haven't been in the military or police, they know people who are in those professions. They're more likely to have done, some kind of martial arts or something. Like they're just familiar with the realities of what fighting or being in a combat actually does. As where leftists are like, well, yeah, of course I'd go up and beat. Like
Yes.
I've talked to totally delusional people who are like wildly out of shape and have no skills at all, or like the weakest people in the world, and they're just like, yeah, I'm gonna go out and fight these Nazis. I used to
Right.
do that all the time. It's like, no, man, I know you didn't. Like, there's no, you are as soft as butter, man. Like, there is zero chance you have fought a single fight in your entire life, much less that you're going out, doing battle with skinheads. Like, but they really do. They go around and talk about like, this is something I would absolutely involve myself in, even though there's no connection to reality there.
Oh yeah. I've seen that, of course, myself as well. It's very pervasive, but it's indicative, though, that they are thinking about this. They're ruminating about
Yeah.
violence quite a lot, and to excessive degrees in the way that the right doesn't. The rumination on violence. Sometimes rumination can cause to action, can lead to action, not inherently, but again, where you find the disconnect then is that when they do have to make that move from thought or feelings into action, they can't manifest the outcome that they want. And I think the recent shooting was at Texas at the Dallas ICE facility, where shot was trying to shoot ICE agents and ended up shooting and
Yeah,
killing, I
only
think, three,
detainees. Yeah,
the
amazing.
detainees.
Yeah.
Yeah, which was, it happened when I was working on reading all these data, and I was like, oh my god, well there it is. I mean, that's a perfect exemplar of that. That if they finally, I think maybe some of them do recognize that they're not capable of doing violence, which may prevent them from doing it. They don't have a familiarity with it. There was a very funny clip that went around maybe like 10 years ago now of a games journalist having to hold up a virtual firearm in VR headset and started crying about it. So I think there's a big disconnect there. They ruminate again, think about how all the violence they want to commit, and in their heads, they're very, I think, convinced of it. But then when you have to transfer from those thoughts into actions, and then actually going and doing it, there's a big disconnect, and hence why they're not as good at it. They're not as skilled at accomplishing violence and enacting violence than the right tends to be.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to claim any kind of incredible expertise, but I've, a lifetime of shooting at the range and been in a lot of different training scenarios and that kind of thing. And it's just always bizarre because, again, I've worked with brand new shooters, people who have never touched a gun. I've worked with experts, guys who've earned their living shooting guns. And when you look at those different training scenarios and then you watch some of these videos that people will do about like their leftist gun club getting together. We're worried about the homophobes now. We're worried about the transphobes. We got to protect us, and we're going to learn. And you watch these people, and it's like they can't get one guy in the room to help them like just learn like how to handle a gun. It's honestly terrifying. Like I can actually feel my anxiety for them when I see them trying to train, because they just like they're flagging each other with firearms constantly. They have no clue how to operate. It's just bizarre. It's like watching children who like maybe got all of their information on operating a gun from a Jason Bourne movie, like trying to get at the range, and it's terrifying sometimes.
Oh yeah, I've seen a lot of those videos. What was it? I don't remember the name of which one was it. John Brown Gun Club. That's their big one, and sometimes they'll put up videos of them training. And yes, it's a bit sad, but I think that is the kind of, I wasn't surprised once, I go see it in the data. It's like, oh, okay, well, that makes all this stuff make more sense. They are sitting there ruminating. They think about violence at least as much. And then again, looking into it, it seems far more often. They're constantly thinking about violence, but they don't have the tools or the skills. It's not the motive. They definitely have the motive to do it. They don't have the skills to do it. And that's a good thing, I suppose. I think it's actually a positive thing that these people are not capable of violence. It seems that many people on the right in my just, interacting in the milieu seem to want these people to be more directedly violent. I think the fact that they are kind of pathetic and unorganized might be a good thing. And people want that to have a bogeyman to fight against. And just like they don't want the right to be violent in any way. And I think we should, maybe the data are all wrong. It's possible these data sets are completely skewed and BS. And I did go through them to check that they were largely correct, but it's totally possible because of things that are left out, for example, that they are BS. But from what I was able to pull from the potentially flawed, and again, I know they are flawed, as I point out, data sets, it's not an issue of the right is more or less violent. They're just more capable of actually, when they set out to cause harm, to actually cause harm.
Well, I mean, I certainly don't want the left to be better at violence, to
be
fair. But I do think there is a certain aspect of this, I've spoken about it before, where the fact that the left is so cartoonishly inept with violence kind of lulls people into a false sense of security because they don't take that violence seriously. In fact, I made this exact reference when we were talking about shooting the detainees instead of the ICE agents. If the Antifa terrorist had murdered 3 ICE agents that day, I think we'd be looking at a very different scenario. Right? I think there would be a much different level of seriousness when it comes to the Trump administration, the way they're cracking down, the way that the public ultimately is responding. I think there's a reason that people had a much more visceral reaction to that National Guard soldier being killed as opposed to just a random shot going by somewhere. And so, of course, again, I wish she was not dead. I do not want the left to be more effective at this. But I do think there is this kind of slow boiling of the frog that occurs because leftists are so inept that you're like, okay, another one. Like it's kind of like Wile E. Coyote. As long as he misses the Roadrunner most of the time, it's a harmless cartoon. But the one time he catches the Roadrunner, it's not so funny anymore, right? I think that's kind of the situation. It lulls people into this idea that, well, yes, the left is violent, but they're like toddlers, swinging at my knee. It's not real violence.
Well, I mean, I think that's why Charlie Kirk's assassination was so shocking to people,
Yeah.
because I mean, they took two swipes at Trump and didn't manage to kill him. And at least for me, the way that when Charlie Kirk was assassinated, I thought there's no way he's dead, because I mean they keep missing Trump, so there's no way they hit him. But and it does maybe lull people into a false sense of security. But I think the thing that I tried to be clear about in my videos is exactly is that these people are extremely violent in their thoughts. Just because they're incapable, or well, not incapable, just because they're incompetent doesn't mean they are inherently not capable of being capable. They can, and if there's enough of them, and because at this point, like I've said, the most recent data show that, well, this year, 2025 is the first year that leftist violence in the United States, at least as of the data collection set for at least the last 30 years, has surpassed right-wing violence. And significantly so. It's about 5 times higher this year. No, it's by 5. So I think it's like 1 to, it was 0 to 5. It might be 1 now. It's in the single digits of the ones that were categorized by that particular data set, the Strategic Institute study. But if it's that much higher than the right, and what I also found is that if you look at it over time, if there's a year where there's more right-wing violent attacks, terrorist attacks, the next year there'll be more left-wing violent attacks. And it happens cyclically and in response to one another. And it was that way, looking at it back since 1947 and since 1975. You have 1 year more right-wing violence, the next year is more left-wing violence, next year more right-wing violence, back and forth forever. So right now, if 2025, once the data finish coming out on it, and it's true that the left has finally surpassed the right in terms of terrorist attacks, it means the amount of violence in intent, this is not necessarily true, but it seems to be implied or to some level. The violent intent that's going on in these communities has to be extremely high for them to
Right.
succeed at this many as they have. So these people are on edge, and they must be, for them to finally surpass the right.
Well, and you're right that there's a certain level of inference here, but I think it's an educated one. When you look again at the response to Charlie Kirk's death, I think as bad as Charlie Kirk's death was, for a lot of people, the response was the really chilling thing, because
Yes.
rather than turn around and say collectively, we don't do this, this is evil, this has to stop, we all looked, and yeah, some leftists did the, well, you shouldn't do that, violence is always bad. But just below the surface of pretty much everybody
Yes.
on the left was this, well, I wouldn't have killed him, but he had it coming. And this
Yeah.
this is just what you deserve. And when you see that as kind of the unified opinion of
Yes.
the left, not just the radicals, not just the extremists, but the average politician, the average news commentator, your neighbor, when
Yes.
you see that, like that really tells you how, as you're saying, that whole left wing, even if these people are disjointed and incompetent and generally not as good at this, when there's that level of resentment built up on the entire left, as you say, that intensity is building and building and building, and that becomes increasingly terrifying. And it's interesting because this mirrors, I think, in more the political science realm, something that we've worked with and kind of neo-reactionary thought, which is this idea that ultimately the left is the kind of the party or the movement of kind of gradual wins, right? Like they have this kind of constant entropic thing working for them. They don't need to be organized. They don't need to be centralized. They don't need to be necessarily effective, because like the natural gradient of politics is that they're kind of unorganized violence or unorganized efforts are going to slowly wear away. And it's only when the right finally gets fed up and centralizes and becomes unified, they flip a switch immediately, right? The left is kind of always violent, kind of simmering, but bad at it. And then the right eventually gets fed up and just says, now we effectively come in and just crush this, right?
Yes, and I covered a study that looked at exactly that too, or some analysis of data, and it was that normally when there is a conservative or right-wing leaning person in power in a society, there is less right-wing violence. That isn't the case in the opposite, in reverse. When there's a left-wing leader in power, there's not less. It continues. They continue to just, be angry all of the time. There's no pressure valve that switches off for them. It just is always building, seemingly. At least, as of the last 30 to 40, 50 years, depending on the country, because I also looked at data out of South America on that. And it also depended on whether or not people were supportive of terrorist activities, supportive of watching a terrorist action occur. Whether or not they were supportive of that also was dependent on who was in power. And if there was a left-wing group in power, then people were actually more supportive of left-wing violence. But when a right-wing group was in power, they weren't more supportive of right-wing terrorist violence. So it seems that being in power gives people who are broadly on the left a sense that, oh, now is our chance. We'll take all of it. We'll take more and more, get more violent. And the right instead goes, okay, we've got power now. Let's back off.
Now, obviously, there's a certain level of speculation here, but again, I think
Mm-hmm.
it's well supported. Thinking about that topic, you spoke about that outgroup preference on the left. And one of the things about having an outgroup preference is you have basically declared war on your own in-group, right? That
Yes.
implicit in that is that you've rejected your own in-group for that outgroup, which means, in my mind, you feel constantly under siege, right? Because you are surrounded, by definition, by a group you do not align with, and you feel that you are willing to reach out to what would otherwise be a hostile group and kind of leverage them back against your own in-group. And so I feel like that is why, to some extent, leftists are more constantly angered, working towards violence. They find themselves in this just basically, war against all, because of the way that they view the world, the fact that they have eschewed their in-group for the out-group, as where right-wingers, once kind of their guys in power, they can relax. They're not at war with everyone around them, right? As where a left-winger comes to power, they're just like, and now the revolution can really begin, and let's get rid of that in-group.
And that was exactly what I found in the research on it as well. Is that, they're not identical in that way. The left pushes for more power. When they get a little bit, they push harder than ever. That's when they get actually sometimes the most violent. The right, when they get into power, they back off massively. And it's even just having support. I found that in analysis of European countries, that when there was a right-wing populist party, right-wing support for violent activism of any sort just plummeted. They had one, so there's a little bit of right-wing populist representation, and it fell through the floor comparatively to basically any other country that didn't have right-wing populist representation. But that wasn't the case for left-wing populist representation, whatever that really means, how they categorize that. But it was only the case for right-wing ones.
So, and again, I'm not sure if this is in your wheelhouse, but when we look at that choice of out-group preference, okay, we can understand why in-group preference exists. I feel like that's pretty obvious that there's an evolutionary advantage for binding together and creating this. And, I've seen other guys like Ed Dutton talk about why something like Christianity was one of the most powerful weapons in kind of making the West what it was, because it allowed for you to scale up in-group preference. You had a new way to still keep the upsides of in-group preference while expanding it to more and more people and getting the benefit at scale. So what would be the advantage ultimately of out-group preference? Why would people choose that strategy for survival? Is it just the weak and the outcasts that are like, looking for something else? I don't feel like that's true of many liberals. They're often rich and these, these other aspects that mean they probably don't need, to bring in like some kind of foreign power to defend them against the in-group. So why choose that strategy?
I'm not really sure why they do, because there isn't any strong evolutionary rationale to do that, except it might be perpetual in-group victimhood orientation, which is a scale that is very lacking in further analysis, or something related to that, which is that one thing that you find across the people who identify as left is that they all seem to also be victims, or very highly identify with victims. They see themselves as victims in their own lives, almost unilaterally. It's such a consistent theme. In one way or another, they've been victimized. They've been victimized by society, by capitalism, by racism, sexism, homophobia. Every single one has a victim status, and I think that appears to be a thing that binds them together. So I guess it's, and in some of the very little research that's been done on perpetual in-group victimhood orientation, which has been done in Israel, because you certainly have two groups there that both think they are perpetual victims. One may have stronger claims to that than others, but than the other. But it does, regardless of what you make of it.
I won't make it spicy by asking you which one, but yeah, go ahead.
But whatever you make of that, clearly both sides think they are victims.
Yes.
And so you have a very interesting environment to study it in. And when people think that they're victims and they have a legitimate claim to being a victim, they think that they deserve to be given things. They think that they're owed all of this stuff. They have to be bowed down to. They have to be listened to because it's their right as victims. I mean, and they're owed that by other people. So if you have one thing that does appear to tie much of the left together is this perception of being victimized in some way. And so that might be it, is that I am owed these things, I'm due these things because of my victim status with people who you otherwise would have nothing in common with, but we're all victims together under capitalism or whatever, you know?
Right. Well, I think this is a fascinating study. I'm glad that you dove into this because I have had this discussion in my own personal life, you know, and I of course knew that there was a lot more to this, and I had inferred several of the problems that you were talking about, but having that analysis is very useful, of course. And you do a lot of great work with social science. Again, people should go check out your work so they can get that background that you're not even getting in academia sometimes. Before we go to the questions of the people, where can people find your work right now?
Yeah, it's Aydin Paladin on YouTube, AYDIN PALADIN. And I've got a new video coming up on myths about the psychology of Christmas. That'll be done before Christmas. Everyone thinks that Christmas is like, or not everyone thinks, I guess many do now, that Christmas is miserable. It's the worst time of the year, actually. We've been lied to that Christmas is a good time of year. Oh, and don't go home because you'll fight with your conservative family. And in fact, avoid them, cut them out. All of that's fake, all of it. Almost everything about Christmas being depressing and the worst time of the year and everyone, tops themselves. All of it's just not in the data whatsoever. Complete made up crap. So that'll be fun. That'll be out soon if you want to watch that as well.
My theory, I have not seen the video, of course, but my theory is that Hollywood is full of narcissistic misanthropes who hate their families and hate America. And so they just pour all of that rage and guilt and anger into their work. And because that's what people consume about Christmas, they just believe that, even though that's not their actual experience.
Yeah, it sure seems that way.
I hope I didn't just spoil it. Sorry, I wouldn't.
Oh, no.
Out for the video.
I think he could have probably figured it out. But yes, that is more or less what I believe is going on as well.
All right. Guys, make sure that you're checking out Aydin's work, even if I'm spoiling it. And then let's go over to your questions here. Let's see. We've got Quizox Chatterack says, thanks, Aydin. An Aydin Paladin
Thanks, man.
fan. We got Quartz saying it would be interesting to see how they would file Islamic terrorism or pro-monarchist anti-American paramilitary units in Canada, not the same side. Yeah, actually, I did mean to ask you about that. So obviously, we look at, let's say, something like religious terrorism, right? You get some kind of Islamic terrorism. People would right-wing code that because it's religious at some level, but obviously, Islam, Muslims tend to vote Democrat. They tend to be part of the Democrat coalition. So if we get a Islamic terrorist attack, is that right-wing violence coded in most of these or left-wing?
Well, I can tell you how I had an easy way of getting around that. I just categorized Islamic terror as its own thing.
Oh, okay.
So I just removed. It is its own thing, I think.
Sure.
Because for the exact reasons you just stated, they tend to vote Democrat, but then some people say, well, they're very religious, they're conservative, they're culturally conservative. So I said, well, just cut them out of it. Sorry, I should have been more clear about that beforehand. I just removed Islamic terror because also you can't even see the rest of the data if you include Islamic terror. I have a graph of it, and when you look at the death and injury accounts, it's just this massive total bar, and then you can't even see left and right on it. It's not, you cannot represent it visually. So yeah, I cut them out.
Which is why both of our countries need to expel these people and put bans on their entry. But it is interesting, this is another problem, I think, ultimately with assuming that the sides are ideological, right? These political coalitions, Muslims are not in the leftist political coalition because they agree with the leftists. I mean, you look at Black Americans, they're some of the most culturally conservative people in the US, but they are also the most likely to vote for the Democrats. This idea that there's natural conservatives with natural conservative values. No, actually, over and over again, what we see is the people who have the values vote for the left because the left is the party of taking stuff from people who are Americans and giving it to new people. It has nothing to do with your ideology.
Yes. I also excluded stuff that was explicitly anti-government because, or I put it in its own block and then ran a different analysis on that because what is anti-government depends on what the government is.
Is Ted
So
Kaczynski right wing? Is he left wing? Is he an
I didn't want to
environmentalist
deal with the
or is
TED
he, yeah,
question.
yeah.
So, so I cut out the stuff that was like wholly anarchistic just anti-government in one way or another that wasn't ideological to help make it a little clearer.
Elijah Timon says, how should I respond to young men who express the reluctance of the right to engage in violence is why we've been losing for the last century? Well, I'll say this, man. You're in a scenario where you have control of the government, at least theoretically, right? And so this is why, for instance, after the response to Charlie Kirk's assassination, I said, we need to see as much action as possible under the color of law from the Trump administration, right? There is great power in operating under the color of law, especially when you are conservative. We are the side of order. The right is the side of law and order. We want things to be done orderly. That doesn't mean violence doesn't occur, right? As my friend John Doyle says, very cool and very legal, elimination of the left, right? Like we
Right.
It's not that we don't want it done. We just want it done in an orderly fashion. We want people standing in lines. Okay. So that's really, I think, key. I'm not going to tell you that you need to be involved in violence, but I'm also not going to tell anyone that there, as we've discussed with the American Revolution, there's just like never this point at which violence is an option, right? Like at some point when you're coming for me and my family and my kids, whatnot, violence is the option.
Yes.
Violence is the moral option, right? And so this idea that there's just never justified political violence is not true. Like at some point, it's okay to stop the communists, even if it's under Franco, right? So that's kind of always been my position. But right now, that's not where you're at. You're in a situation where a guy who can wield the violence of the state against your political enemies exists. So put your energy towards making that happen rather than getting yourself in trouble and creating extrajudicial scenarios.
Yes, do not crime is what my friend says. So do not crime.
Yes, everything very legal and very cool. Yes. Shaker Silver says, might need to get ahead of Lindsay types using the Candace crash out as an I told you so against the right that wants to win and not cut to the system. I mean, honestly, at this point, I haven't even seen James talking about this. It's irrelevant. I know somewhere in the void he's firing off messages, but Candace Owens' behavior is currently, I think, bad. I think we can kind of generally decry that.
Yeah.
I think we just point that out and move on. We don't have to give any credit to anyone. That it's as easy for us that disagree with James to point out that she has behavior as it is for him to point that out. So let's just all point that out and not give him any air.
Agree. Yes.
Cherry Coke Nixon says, yet another near Democrat sweep last night. Where is the right focus? Conspiracy nonsense and Trump denying political reality. Thanks, Owens et al. And again, this is, I think, a big problem for the right. As soon as Aydin pointed out here, the left, when they get power, they want more power. When the right gets a little bit of power, they decide now's the time to get in a circular firing squad. As much as I need to, I will point out people who are causing problems on the right and keeping us from winning. But I really want my focus ultimately to be on defeating the left right now. We don't have a lot of time left with the momentum that we need to make things happen. And that's really where I want my focus to be. So yes, there's a lot of stupid stuff going on. I'll acknowledge it's stupid. I'll point out it's stupid, but I'm going to go back to saying we need to defeat the left. That's where I'm keeping my focus right now.
Yeah.
And the Shade Master says, can Aydin tell us what the Las Vegas shooter was categorized as?
Oh, I just didn't deal with it. I just cut it out. Because who knows? No one knows. It was so bizarre. There were a couple cases like that where I knew the case. It was very clear it didn't fit nicely into anything. And again, my analysis of the data are going to be flawed because the data are flawed and because everyone's going to have to come to some sort of decision when you do an analysis like that to say, well, where does what fit where? And even so, you could know everything that there is to know about a particular case and that not really be the motive that was going on in someone's head, because you can't, it's metaphysically absurd. You can't ever really know what was driving someone, I suppose. It could always be an elaborate ploy, I guess. But consistent across time, consistent across countries, consistent in for all these different types of groups, whether they be environmental and animal rights activists or BLM anti-white activists, which are astonishingly included in those data sets. They call them anti-white. I was shocked by that, but that was a bit of a surprise. It didn't matter what kind of leftist group, same sort of pattern of behavior. Just as likely to do an attack, less likely to kill and injure.
And Major Metroid says, what happened to the Broken Crown podcast?
I'm here and said, we'll do it tomorrow. I left a community note, so we'll be back tomorrow at the same time, 7:30 p.m. GMT.
Yeah, I didn't think about the fact that I was doing my classic move of individually inviting two halves of a podcast on slowly. I did that with the good old boys, and I've done that with CJ and them over at I've done that with several podcasts. So glad I could complete the set on this one as well. Have both of you on. All right. Well, it has been fantastic to talk with you, Aydin. As always, people, please go check out her work if you have not done so yet. And of course, if it's your first time on this channel, you need to click subscribe on YouTube, the bell, the notification, you know what to do. And of course, if you want to get these broadcasts as podcasts, then you need to go to your favorite podcast platform and subscribe to the Auron MacIntyre Show. When you do, leave a rating or review. It helps with the algorithm magic. Thank you, everybody, for watching. And as always, I will talk to you next time.